You are listening to Fika with Vicky on United Public Radio, 107.7 and 105.3 from New Orleans.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Fika. Our guest today is Morgan Daimler. Morgan is an author, a witch, a teacher, and a fairy expert. She has written many books delving into mythology, folklore, and the spirituality behind them, even earning herself a place on Watkin's 2023's list of the 100 most spiritually influential people living today. But what I didn't know about Morgan when I started looking into her work is that Morgan is also a fiction writer. And I feel richer for having learned that. I have always understood the need for character representation for others, but never ever thought I needed it for myself. If I admired a quality in a character, I chose to represent it in my life. It's the qualities that count, the inside, right? But when I read, and this is a quote from Morgan's Into Shadow, and I'm going to try to get this right. Mirren, farm wife and town scribe, mother, plump from a job that meant mostly sitting down, with heavy glasses over a pair of weak green eyes, wearing pants borrowed from her brother that bagged around her ankles, and a farm wife's heavy work dress. She was not the picture of a hero in anyone's mind. I thought, ooh, I like this book, and got a little more cozy in my chair, feeling a warm personal welcome from Into Shadow. So thank you, Morgan, for that warm welcome to your writing, and welcome to Fika.
Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
It's lots to talk about. But I wanted to start with your fiction because that is new to me and I'm very excited about it. So we'll start with a technical question, if that's okay. Since you've written all of these other books with that take research and fact, and what's the difference between that and your fiction writing?
Sure. So for me, fiction writing is what I do for fun. It's storytelling, it's creating these worlds, creating these characters, or letting these characters speak through me. Whereas, the nonfiction, like you said, it's very research heavy, and it's something where I'm really striving to be fair and unbiased and just sort of give the information to people without putting a lot of my own opinion into it, as much as possible anyway. Whereas fiction, I get to play more, I feel like. To be fair, I do a lot of research for my fiction too.
Yeah, I was going to say that is obvious, but I had to distinguish them somehow.
No, I understand. I think it's just a bad habit. I like research. I had written a novel the end of last year that was set in 1912. And I ended up just the amount of things that I learned about what the world was like, what the United States was like at that time period. I think I spent more time researching that than it took me to actually write the book.
But it's all for a cause because you truly absorbed it. So it came out probably in ways that you didn't even know. Right.
Well, and it's so fascinating. Even when you're researching for fiction, to just get that different point of view and to understand like how other people do things or how the world was, 100 years ago or what have you. So I definitely enjoy it.
And it helps to put a lot of things in context that we see happening even now in our lives. So, okay. So we finished that one. So I wish I had known about your Between the Worlds series before when I had enough time to read it before this interview, this conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about it so others might want to read it as well?
Sure. So Between the Worlds was the first fiction that I started writing. I wrote the first novel, I believe, in 2013, the end of 2013. Might have been 2014. To be honest, 10
it's
years
okay.
ago,
Life is a blur.
Yeah. It's been a while. And that series actually has 9 full novels, a prequel, and then a novella. So it's kind of taken on a life of its own. But it's urban fantasy. So the premise of it is it's set in our world in 2014 initially, that 100 years prior to that had experienced this sort of cataclysmic event where the world of fairy had merged with the human world, our world, so that you kind of have this patchwork of reality going on, where some places are like human world would be, and some places are fairy, and then there's sort of these in between places, which is where the story is set. The main character lives in this town that's sort of right on the border between a fairy area and a human earth area. So I get to have all the like technology and all of the setting that's familiar to people, but also put a lot of folklore and fairies and elves and interesting things and magic into it. And obviously I really enjoy writing it because I just keep adding to it.
I was going to say, like, one of the most important things I think for a writer is to enjoy what they're doing, is to be, into it, obsessed by it, whatever. and that shows when someone's reading it.
I think sometimes we just, as a writer, you kind of feel like the story takes over a little bit, and there's just so much more to say. So you just keep writing, keep adding more to it. But that's another one where I wanted to have a main character who wasn't what people normally expect. I guess that's sort of my thing when I write fiction. You'd mentioned with Into Shadow, Muirin is, in her late 30s, almost 40s. She had 4 children. She, was not anyone's image necessarily of what a hero would be. She has to wear glasses or she can't see. And in Between the Worlds, my main character is also plus sized and has an injury in the first book, which is not much of a spoiler because it's a major thing in all the other books, and ends up having to, deal with some mobility issues. So she has a bad leg, effectively. Later on in the series, she ends up wearing a leg brace and having to use a cane. And, she's still the main character. She's still the one who's sort of driving the action and doing all the important stuff. And I wanted to put that out there because I don't think there's enough of it in fiction.
Well, no, I didn't even realize how, like I said, how important that was to me till I was like, ooh, she's still very much a baby, age-wise to me. But, when you throw around words like old or whatever, I can pretend that part. And it is important. Like, I feel like these are the kind of books that would really do well in a Comic-Con kind of D&D kind of population. And these people they are reflective of that in a lot of ways. They find their adventure through books and things like that. So I think it's wonderful. And I just want to take your books on the road. I'm just like, I know where they will sell. I already have my son. He has a friend and, they play D&D and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, for her birthday, this is what you need to get her. Okay, she better not be watching this, but it's like, you need to get her this book. I'm telling you. So
awesome. And I hope it's going to have a lot of appeal, to a lot of people. I wrote it and I wrote the main character the way that I did because, I'm sure you can understand this as well. I read a lot. I read a lot across a whole range, but generally, fantasy and urban fantasy are my favorite genres. And the main characters tend to be very similar. We'll just say
her long flowing hair. If I hear that one more or if I read that one more time, no.
And it's a lot of people who are very young, and generally able-bodied. I don't think personally, and I would love if people can give me any references for stories like this, but I haven't personally seen any main characters who legitimately need glasses to function. I've seen a few where the character has glasses, but they don't really need them.
because glasses are complicated. I think I mentioned to you, and I hope this isn't a spoiler because I just think it's the most romantic thing, is that one character enchanted her glasses so they couldn't break. And I sat there and thought, oh my goodness, so many times I was hiking or whatever, you're out there overnight camping, you can't do contacts. You have to be less adventurous because your glasses might break and then you're in for a real adventure. So that little tidbit, that little point, I was just like, oh, she's so good. She brought up the glasses, which who would think of but you, Morgan? That was.
Yeah. I think it helps that I have glasses.
So you get it.
Yeah. And that was part of why I wrote it, is that I wanted to see someone more like, at least in some ways, more like me. Because I think we should all be able to have stories where we can see ourselves as we are, in the story.
That's it. There's a place for both ways of writing. And but it is, I know with the older population, like a lot of authors that I know are older, and the one keeps saying we need an OA writing book group, and I think that is important. Like, I know that I love to read books about people a little bit older than I am. Mm-hmm. So it gives you an idea that life is still going on for them, right?
Yeah. There's a great author in Connecticut that I know of. Her name is Betty Bono. I'm not going to remember the name of her book. Unfortunately, I can picture the cover, but I can't think of the name. But her characters are all retired. They're people who are, over 60, over 70. And they get into all these like time travel shenanigans and like saving the world kind of stuff. And I love it because it's showing that like wherever you are in life, you can be the hero in a story.
That's right. And your life hasn't ended. You still want that adventure. You still want that. And I think you did it. Okay. So for future reference, is that Bono?
Yeah, I'm going to look it up to make sure I'm spelling it correctly. But her first name is Bette.
Okay. So it's not. Look at what I'm doing it different. That's right, people. It's a kitchen table conversation. We have things we want to know.
I will always recommend other great authors and other great stories. And the last name, is Bono.
Okay.
Book is called The Better Angels.
Okay.
I believe. Yeah.
So you feel strongly about representing everybody in your
trying
book.
To.
And well, you can only write, so I mean, you write a lot. You're still young. There is time to reach everybody as you work along with this, Morgan. Okay. Oh, well, there it is. Ben already put it up there. Ben Stimson. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you for commenting. So now I have it in writing.
Yep, and that's it. The Better Angels by Betty Bono.
So we have it there, people. Okay. So is there anything else we should mention about your fiction writing?
I mean, I could probably talk about my fiction writing for hours. Like I said, it's my fun writing. It's what I enjoy doing. Mostly what I do is write nonfiction. So that's the bulk of what I have out there. But you get me started talking about my fiction and I won't stop because it's my favorite thing.
Well, it's fun to write and it's fun to read. It is a weekend, like a cozy Saturday, rainy day kind of book.
Yep. One of my beta readers actually described Into Shadow as darkly wholesome, which is one of my favorite things.
Actually, that's a good one.
Because, in a lot of my work, I try to tackle some heavier subjects. Like Into Shadow has a lot to do with grief and overcoming grief. But I always try to make it positive. I think there's a lot of hope in the world, even when we're dealing with really difficult things. So hopefully that shows.
And well, even in this one, dealing with grief, taking action, even if you regret it later, just is a good thing to do because it gets you out there and moving forward, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's that moving forward, I think, that's really important.
And if you have a dragon to take care of, that's a lot of moving forward. Okay, we have a question from Brian. Thanks for asking. Okay, so we sort of covered that, Brian, but the actual process. Brian is also a writer, and he's very much into the process. Like, you know what I'm saying. So, what's different between the writing fiction and writing nonfiction?
Sure. So, and I'm sure I'm probably a very atypical writer in how I approach things. So I'm about to horrify everyone who like very carefully plans all of their plot points. But when I do nonfiction, I generally will work up an outline of all the points I want to make sure I touch on. Like I do a lot of what they're called pagan portals. They're like introductory books in this series, and they're short. So I have to cover everything as concisely as possible. So I'll map out like what chapter headings I want to use, and then sort of research and write it from there. When I do my fiction, I generally have an idea of the inciting incident, as they say, like what's going to start the story and where I want the story to go, like how I want it to eventually wrap up, and kind of the major plot beats along the way. But I mostly just sit and write and let the story sort of tell itself. Which, like I said, I know that horrifies a lot of people that are more strictly outline based for fiction. So I think that's part of why I think the fiction's more fun, because it's more of a free form process. It's not as rigidly structured as my nonfiction. I just start telling the story, and then I get to see where the story goes as much as the readers do later.
Now I have to ask you something from a from a writing, because once you know the ending of the story and you're back to the actual like working of the writing, do you sometimes find it difficult to get back to the working? Like, you know the ending, you know what's going to happen. Does it get a little boring from that point?
See, I think part of what helps me with that is because I don't rigidly plan everything in between. So for me, part of the fun is seeing how are we going to get there? You know, what is going to happen that's going to lead us from that, you know, opening chapter to that ending chapter, and then seeing everything that goes on in between. And usually by the time I get to the end, you know, it's a little off center from what I had originally thought. But it's always been a process that works well for me. So that's kind of...
and it's good to know where you're going. Even
yeah. It helps.
It helps. Otherwise, there's like 50,000 words and no place to go.
Yeah. I think for me, like, that's the important, as long as I know how I'm starting, like what begins the story and roughly like how I want it to end, like where is this gonna wrap up. Only once have I written a book where like halfway through I realized that the ending I had originally planned was not going to make any sense. That, you know, I had my beginning, which was great, and then I'm like, well, this is where it's going to end, and I got like halfway into it, and I'm like, none of these characters would do the things that would have to happen for this ending to happen. So I kind of had to take a minute and revise. And I actually think it worked out a lot better. I think the ending made a lot more sense and was a lot more emotionally impactful because I didn't try to force it to go with my original plan.
Was that in Into Shadow, or was that one of your other books?
That was one of my urban fantasy novels. I believe it was book 6. You know, all the others, I had the beginning, I knew where they were going. The first 3 of Between the Worlds, which is my urban fantasy series, I knew when I started the first book, it was going to be a trilogy, kind of what was going to happen in the first 3 books. And that worked well in the 4th book, and then the 5th book. And then I got to book 6. And like I said, I'm like, well, this is how it's going to start. This is how it's going to end. And I got halfway to that ending and I'm like, oh no, none of this is going to make any sense. And if I try to do it this way, it's going to feel very unnatural for who I've established these characters to be. It's just things that they wouldn't do. So we went in a different direction. But I think it ended up being a much better book because of that, because I didn't try to make it.
You didn't try to make it fit. You went with the flow and what those voices in your head, those characters were telling you to do.
It's true what they say. You'll see on social media people joking about, that they're not actually writing, they're just documenting what their characters do.
Yeah, no.
And
we all have...
Yeah, no. You hit a certain point where you're like, I'm not even making this up. I'm just seeing where it goes.
I'm just moving the fingers. They're doing the direction. Yep. They're a part of you. Okay. Ben would like to know, how do you deal with characters' death in your works? What's your process? How does it affect you with someone you've developed dies?
That's a good question. I try my approach to writing characters' deaths in stories, which I have had characters die. I'm not one of those authors who, will not kill off a character, but I think that it always has to make sense in the story. It can't feel like you're killing off the character just to get an emotional reaction from readers, or, just because you've decided you're going to. It has to feel like this is what would have happened if this story was real. So my approach to it is always like, is this necessary or not? And if it is necessary, then I try to just go with it as naturally as it unfolds. To be honest, though, I did end up in one book killing off a character I really, really liked a lot, and it was hard. I actually sat back for quite a while after I realized that was kind of where the story was going, and questioned, like, is there another way I can do this? Could I not? Because I like this character a lot, but it wouldn't have made sense. It would have felt like I was intentionally, like, Deus ex machina, going in and saving the character because I didn't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's just not how I approach writing fiction. I don't want it to feel like if death is what is going to happen in the storyline, I'm going to make it not happen just to save characters that I like. But that was rough, and I was very sad about it, actually.
Because they become real. Ben says you aren't George R.R. Martin, okay? And we all have our problems with George in that matter.
Yeah, I have killed off a couple characters, but I'm definitely nowhere close to his league.
Well, I have to tell you that when I read a novel, and if I have any connection with the author whatsoever, and they kill somebody off that I care about, I usually get a note saying, "Where?" Because I have to put that grief and emotion somewhere, Morgan. So I message the author and say, "No, what did you do?" They usually laugh at me, but then it worked. But
for people who read Between the Worlds, when there's a particular character death in that book, which is the one I was mostly talking about, and I know it upsets readers. It upset me when I wrote it. I was very sad. And if people message me and are like, "Why did you do this terrible thing?" I would honestly be like, "No, I understand. It was horrible."
Well, expect a letter, okay? When I read this. So, okay. So Into the Shadow is coming out June the 1st?
Yeah, I think technically it's 26 May, but the way Amazon is, like, its official publication date is the end of May, but they're not actually going to release it on Amazon until June 1st.
So you can pre-order it on Amazon, and the entire other series is there as well, all 11. So that can keep you. I'm thinking maybe I'll wait till I go on vacation, and then there it will be all set out for me, ready to go. Okay, so now we're going to talk, because they've been very patient, about fairies.
Yes.
And why fairies, Morgan? What drew you to fairies?
I will quickly add, as we segue into this,
okay.
Fiction does include a lot of fairy folklore as well. So apparently there's no escaping that with me. But Why fairies? I had personal experiences that I can't really otherwise explain when I was very, very young. Very, very young. And when I got older, it sort of set me in this direction of wanting to research and learn more about the folklore and learn more about the things that people believed when it comes to fairies. I'm part of the Irish American diaspora. So I grew up hearing about different sorts of beliefs related to this. And it is one of those subjects, once you start researching it, once you start digging into the folklore and hearing other people's personal experiences, anecdotal accounts, it sucks you in. And there's so much to it that, no matter how much you study it, you can never understand all of it, really.
And you mentioned that you did write a lot of pagan portal
I did, yes.
Books, and you said you can't put very much into them, but and I'm going to try this. Yeah. Okay. Has a lot of information in it. It is one of like the most filled fairy information books, like direct that I've seen. So well, I'm a fan, Morgan. Okay. You'll hear lots of that. So we're gonna talk about the practicalities. And you said you've had experiences with fairies, of fairies, because thanks to certain outlets, everybody thinks that fairies are wonderful, and they're sweet and they're kind and they fit in your hand. And I would like to bring up people that Tinkerbell was plotting to get rid of Wendy, so we need to look at that.
Yeah, that is an excellent point that so many people ignore. If even in the Disney movie,
right.
In the Disney movie, she was less vicious than in the original books, but even in the movie, she's legitimately trying to get Wendy murdered.
And it's like everybody just goes, "Oh, look at Tinkerbell," and I'm like, "What?"
Yeah, I think that's because the early 2000s cartoon that was just focused on Tinkerbell, which really made her much nicer. my kids.
You mean she wasn't attempting murder?
Yeah, there's not, as far as I remember, any like shoot down the Wendy Bird stuff going on in the later Tinkerbell movies.
So they either think wrongly that they're sweet like Tinkerbell, or they think they're all bad. Like, just stay away from them. It's But you write that they're a little bit of both, just like humans. And so if someone were to meet a fairy and they're aware of that, what etiquette should they use? How to keep the fairies happy?
I mean, I think the first difficulty is the being aware of it part, because particularly in the US, but our culture has us so convinced that fairies are these tiny little winged, like you said, Tinkerbell type of figures. And what we find actually in most folklore and even modern accounts people discuss is that they look very human a lot of the time. They're not. They'll like suddenly appear out of nowhere and disappear into nowhere and do all sorts of things that just humans can't do. But I think that a lot of people don't necessarily recognize these beings for what they are because they have an expectation that it's going to look a certain way or, act a certain way. The best thing to do if you are in a situation where you feel like a fairy is involved, of any type, be polite. A very big one. Don't lie. They tend to take lying really badly. So you want to try to, be honest. Be respectful, in the sense of, particularly if you're like out and about. We see a lot of cases where people go into places that sort of belong to these beings or are associated with these beings. And, you don't want to be doing things that would be considered rude. Don't break things. Don't, mess with the trees and the plants just because you can. Don't take rocks. Don't, like, none of that stuff.
So basically you're saying just be a decent human being, Morgan.
Yes. Basically just try to be a good guest. I will oftentimes refer to it as like, company manners. Like, try to act the way you would if you were out visiting other humans, and you were trying to be on your, sort of best behavior. Things that we know across the folklore and such upset these beings are things like, being rude to them, saying that you don't believe in them, that you don't think they exist. There's a whole thing like, we're using the term fairies because that's sort of the popular term, but in a lot of places you wouldn't call them fairies. You would use euphemisms: the good folk, the good neighbors, shining ones, the gentry. And the idea is if they are around, because they can be invisible to humans, you're not going to offend them. You're using polite, respectful terms and terms that sort of remind them of their potential to be nice, to be good. So those are all sort of important things to keep in mind. Just, like you said, act the way you would if you were visiting with other humans or meeting other humans and you were trying to be respectful.
And if you do think you've angered the good people, what can you do to rectify that?
I mean, generally they're not subtle. So if you are in a situation where you've offended them or upset them, usually you're going to know. There's a whole list of things they're generally associated with when they're upset with people. But always apologize is a good start. You can also, I'm a big fan of bribery. So you can also offer them
candy. Buy them candy.
Dairy products are really popular. So any kind of milk, cream, butter, honey, baked goods. I mean, who doesn't like a nice, cake, cupcake? Everyone appreciates that. Cookies even. So, and if it is something you can fix, like if you took a stone from somewhere you should have taken a stone from, bring it back. There have been stories where people took stones from like the old the fairy forts in Ireland and used them to build other things. Then they had all this bad luck and all this random negative things happening and people getting hurt and all kinds of stuff. And the best thing in cases like that is put the stones back. Take them back where you found them, return them, kind of the same way you would, again, if you were dealing with another human and you took something that you didn't realize belonged to somebody and they got mad, give it back and apologize.
And you also said that they don't like a lot of chaos around them. They sort of like things to remain the same.
Yeah, this is something Catherine Briggs, who's a pretty well-known folklorist who dealt with fairies. She wrote about them mostly in the 60s and 70s. So some of her work is a little dated now, but she has a whole thing where she discusses the fact that the good folk across folklore, so anywhere kind of in Europe, are very much about orderliness and cleanliness and organization. And they're kind of like beings who appreciate things being in the correct place and being done a certain way. Definitely not fans of mess and chaos and any of that. One of the ways to sort of keep them away from you or to keep them out of your house would to be messy because they don't like that. Whereas, keeping things clean, keeping things organized is something that they're supposed to like, that they're sort of drawn to. So, yeah, for sure.
I agree with fairies on a lot of things. Now, in 21st century fairy, just to give an idea of the different books you have out there and what they have in them, that they're good girl, there. She has it. You talk about how the Victorian era, the little winged fairies, have affected the way we think of fairies today. So just a couple examples, and you can pick one to explain, like pointy ears, wings, size we talked about.
Yep. Yeah, I think that a lot of people don't realize how much of our sort of modern mainstream cultural understanding of fairies is really coming from the Victorians. And not from actual like cultural folklore. And those are both good examples. The idea of fairies having wings, which, again, if you ask most people today, particularly in the US, what does a fairy look like? They're going to include wings with whatever else they say. And wings are actually really new in the grand scheme of how we imagine fairies, and very particular to that viewpoint. It's not something we see even today in most cultures who have like active beliefs around these beings. And it seems to have started, from my understanding of it, based on the work of Simon Young, who's a great folklorist who has done a huge amount of research on this, is that it started in the theater, and as a costuming device to show that this is a fairy and not just another human character in a play. And from there, it kind of went into artwork, and they used insect wings for a couple reasons, but partially because, angels have feathered wings, demons have like bat wings. So you have fairies who aren't exactly either one of those things. What kind of wings would they have? Well, insect wings is kind of what's left. So this idea that they had insect wings, we start to see in artwork during the Victorian period, and then sort of slowly coming into fiction, really in the early 20th century. Peter Pan is a great example of sort of where we first start to see that. And then as it kind of spreads, and now we're seeing it in fiction, we're seeing it in artwork, popular cultures kind of being infused with this idea, then we start to see, around the 1980s, people relaying anecdotal accounts saying that they saw a fairy and that the fairy was small and had wings, which is what we would expect, from the artwork and stuff. But the vast majority of stories we have when it comes to fairies, like I said, they look very human. They're, roughly human heights. Sometimes, there are some that are smaller, 18 inches, 3 feet. But, the bulk of them would be like an average adult human, the majority of the stories. And, we have fairy animals, fairy dogs and cats and horses, and just this whole range of things that you can see and experience, but not wings. When they fly in the stories, they're flying through magic, they're levitating, or, flying on the wind, all that sort of stuff that fairies can do. But the wings are something that Victorians really embedded in the consciousness, if you will.
And do you feel like the fairies personally dislike that image of them? Does it annoy them to be, do you think, or to be portrayed as they are not?
I think that, much like with humans, we're going to have a lot of diversity going on out there. I definitely think there's probably some that are annoyed at that sort of trivialization, being reduced to these like insect-like beings. I also think that there's others that kind of jump on it and are going to encourage that sort of image for that same reason. Like, you're not going to be threatened necessarily by something that's tiny and looks sort of like butterfly. Whereas, in a lot of folklore, fairies were something that you wanted to be cautious of, which we touched on a tiny bit a little while ago, but they can be beneficial. They can do, very, very good things for people, healing in particular, luck, money, but they can also be dangerous. And, if you were something that was really dangerous to humans, I think you'd kind of want them to imagine you as being a little bug.
If you had nefarious plans, it's like, oh, good. They're not going to expect this. So it would depend on the fairy. I think that's reasonable. Okay, so there are many different types of fairies, whether they all should be grouped together or not. We have a tendency to do that.
Yeah.
And so let's take one fairy that everybody on this side of the ocean thinks they know because it's St. Patrick's Day. What about leprechauns?
Sure. So, when we're using the term fairy, particularly the way I'm using it, but the way we kind of find it in a lot of folklore is it's sort of a generic term, more than a specific. So we have all these specific types of beings that sort of get lumped in under this umbrella term of fairies. Leprechauns are one, in modern understandings. And that's another one I think that the Victorians kind of had a heavy hand with. Victorians and marketing departments, because I know in the US, pretty much anyone, if you mention leprechauns, is going to think of like Lucky Charms cereal. So, it's unavoidable. It's just sort of like,
it's
influenced anywhere, commercials and the cereal aisle, and it's inescapable. But that idea of them being these sort of tiny, cheerful, wearing green beings who are a little tricky but not really dangerous, that is definitely something that is different in the last 100 years. And something that honestly can be kind of blamed with Irish Americans, because there was an Irish American author in the late 1800s who wrote about leprechauns, who seems to be the one that described them in this way we understand them today. But if you look at older Irish mythology, because they do show up in mythology, particularly two stories, I'm just trying to remember the names in English, The Adventures of Fergus and the Death of Fergus. We see him, he had a lot to do with leprechauns. And they're described as being about 18 inches high. They're a type of sort of water spirit or water sprite. So like when Fergus first encounters them, getting back into like these nefarious fairies, he falls asleep by a lakeside and wakes up with these 3 leprechauns trying to drown him, which he doesn't appreciate.
No, but they were just having fun. I mean,
yeah, harmless friend. But he fights them off, and he gets them to agree, in order to have their freedom, that they're going to give him something. So they give him the ability to not drown effectively, that he can go underwater and survive, which is awesome, pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking.
Yeah, and that actually I think is where the idea that they grant wishes comes from sort of a misunderstanding of that story, because they were only granting him a wish because that was how they were convincing him not to kill them in retaliation. And we see in the older stories they're not. They actually used to more wear red. Red was the primary color associated with them. There's females, there's males. They're not necessarily all old. They're not all shoemakers. They kind of have their own whole society going on.
But they all seem to have buckled shoes, though. That buckle seems to run through, does it not? Like you mentioned.
In the modern, yeah. In the older mythology,
it's not mentioned?
I mean, you're talking 1,000 and more years ago, so it just wasn't a thing at the time. The shoemaker thing has been around for a while.
So
yeah, if you look up the word leprechaun, or again canach, which is another, it also means leprechaun basically in Irish. But if you look it up in Irish dictionaries, it says fairy shoemaker. And you can find stories, going back quite a ways in Irish folklore of them as these shoemakers, and very tricksy. There's a lot of old stories about a person who finds a leprechaun and captures them and is like, you tell me where your gold is. And leprechaun says, well, if you'll let me go, I'll show you where it is. Yep. And then the person marks the spot, usually with their handkerchief or sometimes a sock, and then goes to get a shovel and comes back, and like every blade of grass or every tree in the field is now covered in identical handkerchiefs and socks or whatever it was.
And so it's like, just try to find it now. Okay, yeah. I'm gonna show a couple comments here, and we'll get back to it. I want to show this one from Brian, telling you, this is supporting your idea of the story.
I agree with everything he's saying.
I'll just read it out if people are on the radio or whatever. So the story is all. As authors, we live only for the story. The story is mother. The story is father. We live to serve the needs of the story.
Yeah. A lot of times it does feel like you're just a conduit to put this story out into the world. There's certainly things in everything I've written, all my fiction. If you asked me, where did this come from, or where did you get this idea, I'd be like, I have no idea. It just
comes. So it's almost like the writing itself is an offering to the story. Like, I will give you all my time and energy, and please let me finish this.
Yeah, I like to think of it as sort of a co-creative process. Like I'm writing it, but it's also sort of writing itself in a way.
It's meat story. And then he said, this discussion about fairy appearances almost sounds like our expectations change how we perceive them.
This is a very widespread debate. And I know it's going on now. It's been going on for a little while, but it's been kind of intense the last year or so as to whether, because I should preface this by saying, fairies are known to have a type of magic which is called glamour. And glamour is something that can affect, actually, kind of the way you might think of it with like Hollywood, but it's something that can affect your senses. It changes how you're perceiving things. So instead of seeing things how they really are, you see things how the fairy or what have you wants you to see it. So we have all of these stories going way back of like the borrowed midwife, where fairies have a low birth rate, so they don't have their own midwives. Woman's having a baby, so the fairy husband goes and gets a midwife to come attend to her. And on the way out, she sees that she's being taken to this grand house and goes in, and everything's beautiful and amazing, and just the most spectacular thing you can imagine, a huge mansion, and helps deliver the baby, and is then given this like ointment to put on the baby's eyes, because normally, as you find out, the mother is actually human, and humans can't often see fairies without assistance. And the midwife is told, don't touch your own eyes, don't use this yourself. But of course, either forgets or has a moment where she just goes to like wipe the sweat off her brow and accidentally touches her eye. And all of a sudden, with the ointment, she can see that she's actually in like a cave, and that the woman that she just helped deliver the baby is actually a girl who's been missing from the local area, who was thought to be taken by the fairies, human girl, human woman. And, she can suddenly sort of see things truly because of this, and see through this glamour, which was making her perceive everything in a different way. So because of that, and the reason I'm sort of telling this story, there's this whole argument about whether humans ever actually see fairies as they really are, or if we always see them the way we expect to see them, which is then what they're giving us. And that's it's like a Zen koan. I don't think we'll ever know which is true. Do we actually see them the way they are on occasion, or are we always seeing that expectation? Are they always giving us what we expect? Is that why people now see little winged fairies when they never did before?
Because that's what they want us to see. Because if you look back in the old stories, they can be gnarled and old and various shapes in that. So
lots of
it. Yeah.
There's a whole argument too with I shouldn't say argument, that makes it sound a little more adversarial.
Discussion.
There's a whole heated discussion between people who study fairies and people who are studying UFOs about whether or not modern UFO encounters are actually fairy encounters. But because humans now, with sci-fi and the advent of all that, have this expectation, as I'm sure some people at least are aware, science fiction started about 100 years ago as a genre, and people relating alien abductions and UFO experiences started in roughly the 1940s, 50s, 60s. I think 1960 was the first abduction account. So is that how fairies are now engaging with people because that's what humans expect? Or the flip side of this, which I'll say in fairness, the ufologist view is, are old fairy encounters actually alien encounters, but people didn't have the terminology for it, so they, understood it as fairies. This is a very complicated debate that's been going on for a long time between the two communities.
I liked your answer. I cheered for that one too in the book because everything becomes aliens, right? And people can think that, but you know, I don't always think that. I think that there is more on Earth than we give Earth credit for.
I mean, I think there's three options. There's it's all fairies, there's it's all actually aliens, and then there's it's both. You know, why not
So
both?
let's just go with both and have a coffee and a cookie. Okay,
Sounds good to me.
we'll be fine. Um, I, I'm yeah. So you we have a tendency, once again, we have a tendency, I'm saying that a lot today, to think of fairies in woodlands and meadows and amongst the flowers, probably because that winged, the whole little winged insect thing. And we don't think about them living in cities and being a part of this whole new tech kind of world. And so tell us more about that.
I think that's another sort of post-Victorian thing that we see. And there's a couple other factors. There was a spirituality called Theosophy that came in the 1880s and 1890s that sort of directly equated fairies to nature spirits and elementals. You have Cicely Mary Barker's flower fairies coming in the 1910s, 1920s. And it all sort of moved the understanding of fairies into this category of nature spirits, manifestations of nature. And I think for a lot of people, nature spirits have to exist out in the wilderness. They have to be things that are in like the wild places and you know, all of that kind of works together. But when we actually look at the various stories and the various folklore, fairies have always been all around. And certainly they are out in wild places and all sorts of things. But they've always been around humans. They've always been in human habitations and cities. We have a whole category of what we would, you know, potentially label as fairies that are basically house spirits. Like they exist within a human home. Whether that's brownies or kobolds or Tamta or Nisa, you know, depending on the culture. But it's this idea that they're sort of intrinsic where humans live. We have stories in Ireland where we don't have the domestic fairies there, but we have stories of fairies going to fairs, harvest fairs, races, horse races, you know, so they clearly have always been kind of all over the place. And we do have stories of city fairies. And even in modern accounts, you know, I talked to someone years ago who believes that she had encountered a fairy, a human-looking fairy, in the basement of the apartment she was living in a city. And there was a video up on YouTube of a gentleman who was in a city walking home from work. He worked in a bar and had an encounter with something which was, I would consider a fairy. He doesn't call it that, but clearly something supernatural, very similar to a particular type of fairy, also called a Genkana, but different from the leprechaun equivalent one because there's sort of dueling definitions for that term. So yeah, the idea that they're only in the wild places and only in nature, I think is ignoring a lot of other evidence and a lot of other stories and a lot of other folklore. They really are everywhere.
And I think it kind of cuts people off from them. If they're, I mean, not everybody can go out to the country for whatever reason, and they can still feel like they're part of that world,
Yep.
knowing that they're in the city as well.
Yeah, wherever you are, you can have a fairy experience or encounter. It is possible.
It is. So, but don't bug them.
No, and I actually should say just really quickly, because I did mention I have my own experiences. One of the experiences I had, which I had with a friend, so it wasn't just me, we both saw this, happened in a city near where I live. It's a smaller city, it's like 40,000 people, but we saw two fairy hounds. And this is literally like in a city on the pavement, you know, on the main road. It wasn't, we definitely were not out anywhere with nature, what we would, you know, label as nature. So yeah, wherever you are, It can
It can
happen.
it can happen. Okay, I want to throw this question in because I also stop writing so many different ideas in your books. Okay. I really liked this one. Okay, so people will go out there on Facebook or whatever and they'll put a picture of a fairy. And then so you have the people that don't believe in fairies saying that's not real. But should a person that believes in fairies say that's not real? No, I think this is what's in that picture. Not calling them out, just saying, no, I don't think that's a fairy. It's almost like they're a traitor. Yeah. And they're saying, you know, they're just downing the whole thing. And you wrote about why you think skepticism is important in a healthy fairy believing community. So we'll just go through that.
Yeah, no, I do. I'm actually, obviously I do believe in these beings.
Oh, really? That's a surprise.
But I think that it is very easy with something like this, when you believe in it or you want to believe in it, to try to see it in everything. You know, you want to prove that it exists, so everything becomes evidence. And I think we have to remain skeptical and realize that, you know, it is possible to believe in this. It is possible for this to be part of your reality. But that doesn't mean that every single thing out there is somehow really a fairy. Like a lot of what you're talking about is a lot of the nature pictures where it's like a blurry leaf or a shadow, and the person will, you know, like circle and show where they're seeing the fairy. First of all, that's really leaning heavily into the idea that fairies are these tiny little nature spirits, which is a discussion in itself. But, you know, the human brain is just hardwired to see human faces and human shapes and things in random patterns. It's called pareidolia. Well, one term for it is pareidolia. And I think we have to kind of be aware of that. Just because you believe in this doesn't mean that every single thing you encounter necessarily is going to be evidence. I personally have heard fairy music, for example, very inexplicable. This is my ex-husband at the time, who was my husband at the time, also heard it. Eerie, uncanny. I know that it's real. I have also had an experience where I could hear some kind of music, but I wasn't sure what it was or what was going on. And I figured out it was my MP3 player. Had somehow turned itself on or been turned on, and it had earbuds. So the music was playing through the earbuds, which sounded really weird. But I was able to sort of eliminate and be like, okay, well, this isn't anything supernatural. This is just, you know, technology. And I think we can have both of those things at the same time. You know, you can have the genuine experience and the belief in it, but also, you know, start by eliminating all the possibilities. Like what could this be? And once you eliminate all of that and there's nothing left, then I think is when we start looking into, you know, this is supernatural. And, you know, if you want to put it that way, this is fairies.
And to know that one picture out of 100 is possibly a fairy is a lot. Like, and you can depend on that as it, because when the other things get discredited, people are just like, see, there's no fairies.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's unfortunate that we have this all or nothing view. We in the, you know, the empirical we, because people definitely are like, you know, well, this one thing was disproven, therefore it means fairies aren't real. It just doesn't work that way. You know, it's just the way things are. You can have a lot of stuff that gets put out there and disproven, but that doesn't mean that it's not genuine. You know, and to use some like real world, human world examples, like there's been animals that scientists swore were extinct and didn't see for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And then there's a picture of one because it wasn't extinct. It's just that no one was encountering it or experiencing it until they were. You know, so there's, as Shakespeare said, I love this quote, but there are more things on heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And there's a lot of things out there, you know, and we don't understand, I think, the majority of what's out there.
No, which is why it's so fascinating to have these conversations and to read books like yours that have all these different ideas in them, presented in a very practical, down to earth kind of way. So yeah, that time is coming. Morgan, did you want to mention anything coming up in your life or books coming out aside from Into Shadow?
Into Shadow's coming out. I have a book on Freya. The Norse goddess Freya is coming out, I believe, in August. And then next year, I am going to forget when, April or March, I have a book on the world of fairy, which I'm really excited about. That's next year, though. Next month, I am presenting a paper at Brown University on fairies and human social deviance, which is much more exciting than that title makes it sound, I promise.
I don't know. It sounds pretty interesting to me. Just to make it quick, which we shouldn't, but I don't think I'm being monitored. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on why some people tend to have encounters with fairies, but others do not?
You know,
Brian, that's from Brian.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have actually thought about this quite a lot, and I used to have some theories, but the more I've sort of talked to people and the more I've seen particularly modern anecdotal accounts, I kind of am in a place right now where I think a lot of it is just random chance. It's the same as, you know, people who experience any other kind of phenomena. Because I've talked to people who were skeptics, who did not believe in these beings, who were very adamantly sometimes, you know, against anything supernatural being real, and then had an experience that they could not otherwise explain. And I've talked to people who very much did believe in this and really set out to engage with it and had experiences. And I've also talked with people who really believe in it and want very much to have an experience and just never do. So there seems to be, at least to some degree, a sort of random chance factor that's a part of it. I do think if you believe and you're actively seeking it, maybe your odds are a little better because you're putting yourself out there more. But
and open to the idea of not just seeing, but feeling, experience. You know, tricky things happening from the leprechauns.
Yeah, for sure.
So I also want to mention that Morgan puts a list of fictional books that stay closer to the fairy ideas in the 21st century fairy. Go to her Facebook page. If you see this anywhere else on Spotify or, you know, anywhere else, there will be a description with links to Morgan in them. I want to thank you so much for coming, Morgan. We didn't even get to touch most of the topics.
It's such a big topic.
Yes, it's so huge, and you have so many books. So thank you, and I'll send you over the link to SoundCloud or whatever, so you can check out there. And thank you so much. All right.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad.
And I'll just say goodbye right now and put you back in your box, and you can find your way home or whatever. Okay, bye, Morgan. Our guest next week will be author Sarah Archer. We're going to do that discussion we've been promising about Ray Bradbury. So if you're a Ray Bradbury fan or just curious about how Fahrenheit 451 might have to say to us today, tune in. Until then, as always, may your coffee be hot and your stories sweet. Thanks for listening, everyone.